Hey guys, what is up? I'm exceptionally pleased to be able to bring you an interview I performed with JeeNiNe. Really appreciate JeeNiNe's time. We'll jump into the interview here in just a moment. First, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First of all, for any of you who do not know who JeeNiNe is a top tier duelist and probably the best invader in the game right now. Probably the only player I know who is both a top tier duelist and an invader. We'll actually talk about that in the interview here in just a moment. The other thing I want to mention is there was unfortunately some audio artifacting. I've done my best to mitigate it, but it is noticeable in a few spots. I do apologize. It's not too awful, but in case you hear it, I want to apologize for that in advance. Again, thanks to my guest JeeNiNe. And with that aside, let's just jump into it. JeeNiNe, thanks so much for making time for this conversation. I'm super excited to be talking to you. Over the time that I've known you and the time I've watched your streams, I've had so many questions that have come to mind, things about how you play the game, the reason you choose to do the things that you do, I've always wanted to talk to you about. And I've also noticed that during your streams, in fact, I would say like during almost every stream, you'll just toss aside some like nugget of wisdom, something about the game that I had never heard before, something I didn't know anything about. And it makes me think that you've just got a ton of Souls knowledge locked up in your head. And I was hoping throughout this conversation we could get to some of it. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, right before it gets irrelevant.
Well, we'll,
Right
we'll talk.
before.
We'll talk about that because I'm actually thinking a lot of it won't be irrelevant. It'll be interesting to see how much of it actually is. Um, so maybe let's start at the beginning. I think one of the things I'd love to know about is kind of the what I'd call the G9 origin story. And I know I've gotten bits and pieces of it. I know you were a For Honor player, and I know you won some tournaments. I think on Xbox. I know you and I both have in common that we used to play Rainbow Six Vegas. Though I think you did PvP, I did the terrorist hunts. I'm curious to understand, like, how did you first get into competitive gaming?
Oh, um, okay, so I honestly it was like more you I started getting into like more serious online gaming with Rainbow Six Vegas, and as time went by, I got sort of introduced to better and better players, and eventually I got to these group of players and people which were really really good and saw the game in a competitive light. At the time, there was not like any like very official tournaments per se, because the Rainbow Six Vegas, the original, came out in 2006, and I don't really remember when the first like MLG tournaments came around, like at this time, but that's how like I got first introduced to good players. It was mostly people from the Bronx, and what's funny is I did not even speak English at the time, so I learned to speak English by playing with those people. And so it also translates into how I speak. Like I'll swear a lot when I speak in English. Like I'll say fucking shit and all that stuff, which is funny because when I speak in uh, my main language, which is French, I don't swear like ever. So it's like I kind of took part of what these people taught me and integrated that, whether I realized it or not, into my everyday life.
That's funny. And actually, you're not the first person I've met who does that. I used to work with somebody from India, and he had his language was sprinkled with all kinds of swear words, and he got them from our boss. Like every the way he talked, he spoke English like our boss did because that's where he had learned most of his English. It was actually really funny. Um, do you think then that meeting like those top tier players that you met at the time, do you think that they kind of showed you what was possible? Like, did that help you grow as a player by meeting those guys, or were you kind of already at that level?
I would say like the way it worked out for me, like how I got introduced to sort of like the scene and whatnot. Like I did not start playing into anything competitively until Rainbow Six Vegas 2, but I was starting to get introduced to these new players where these guys had ambitions. Like they knew stuff I didn't know. Like I did not even know like MLG was a thing back then. Like I did not even know competitive gaming was a thing. Like we have to go back, 2006. Like this was a long time ago. I mean, by by today's standard. And I would say like you start to get introduced to people like that just by playing. If you're passionate about whatever, you get to meet like people of a various skill level, and it kind of goes up and up in competition as you get better, and people start to notice you, and you get invited to these games which have like kind of higher level of players, etc. And at a certain point, like if you're good at something, like everyone that's good knows the other players that are good, and
Hmm.
so it's like sort of like my godfather used to tell me this. It's the cream always rises to the top, like no matter what. You know, it's in your coffee. It's like an analogy, but I feel like this is true for so many things in life, and I think that same thing for gaming, and that's pretty much how I got introduced to it.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to observe. I've noticed the same thing, and I agree. Like at companies I've worked at, I get to know people, and you can kind of evaluate them, how good they are, how skilled they are. And as I look around at most of the companies I've been at, I can say, oh yeah, that person's about slotted correctly, or maybe that person should be promoted, or maybe that person's like a step above where they should be. But by and large, people rise to the level that you would expect, and it's consistent kind of with their performance.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful here though to like I'm not going to say like the world is absolute justice and if you're good like this much you're going to get raised this much or
Yeah.
go up in life this much. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but as a rule of thumb, if you have, perseverance and you develop the skill set, you have a passion for something, eventually it's going to get to you like you're going to get to your objectives. That's mostly what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with that. It's certainly not like a 100% rule. So, okay, so you met some people in the scene, and you obviously you were skilled at the game, and you started developing. And then did you kind of parlay that into other games besides For Honor? Like, were there any other games where you were part of the competitive scene?
Okay, so I kind of skipped the. If you want to jump to Foreigner, I kind of have to give another bit of an introduction. So after all of that, after I met these people, kind of got part of the try hard and the top players community on these games. Over time, you kind of you get better and better as you play with all these great players, and it's funny because all the very top players, like the very very best, and I'm thinking right now of Rainbow Six Vegas too, because this is mostly where I started playing competitively and won like some of my first like $1,000 tournaments and stuff like that. Um, like when you start playing with this circle of people, like every really good players want to seek the very best teammates possible that they can find because they really want to win. Like at that level, it's almost like you don't care who you play with as long as the skill is there. It's like very opportunistic, but I mean in a good way. I've met some really really great people there, and also some people that are not so great. I never really got any issues, like any real issues with any of the players, like in the Rainbow Six scene or even For Honor or any other games. Really, I think like little side note, I've seen a lot of like drama and childish stuff on Dark Souls 3, but even on the higher levels of like other games, I've never actually experienced any of that. Anyway, little side note there. But the transition to like being good at one game to the next, I think a lot has to do with the mindset. So like in Rainbow Six, I've learned a lot of skill set as well. Like it's not just having the proper mentality is part of a skill set. I'm going to elaborate on that, but a lot of it is the way you're thinking and the moment. Like a lot of these video games is reactive on how you think to solve a problem in the moment, and that sort of problem solving ability is something that translates one way and another to a lot of games. Not all games, does not necessarily translate to Minecraft or like I don't know, World of Warcraft. Like obviously there's some major differences between games, but there's some key points here that translate over to different games, and I think that sort of helped me up, uh, like be good at other stuff when I made a transition.
Yeah, so I mean, if I think about and this has been true in my experience, that generally players that are good at one game, they tend to be successful in other games, which indicates that there's like a skill beyond the game skill, like a meta skill, right? Like you know how to get you're good at getting good. Like you're able to identify the steps you need to take to improve, to get better. to rise to the top in any of those games that you've played. And so, do you think that that sort of meta skill is really a mindset?
I think it's a lot of things. I've actually talked about this quite a lot to different people, but I think at the very beginning we can sort of break this down into a formula. I don't necessarily have steps, but I think most importantly, and also like I know we're talking about gaming here, but I think this applies beyond just gaming. Uh, I think if you look at anything you do that you want to be successful at, the step number one, like on anything, any objective really, it's like how much do you want it? It's the desire, first of all. Like, do you have that desire to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve? That's the first thing. So motivation, I think it's really like the base pillar, like to anything really. Like if you don't have the motivation to do whatever you're doing, it's you're not gonna reach that, or maybe you'll reach that goal, but it's gonna take a while. Like this affects like everything very very much. And then beyond that, what really affects motivation and how like successful you're gonna be to reach whatever objective you got, I think really passion, and that might sound cheesy, but how much do you love the thing you want? Like, how do you love? Like, how much do you love the process? Like, do you really like whatever you're doing? Doesn't matter what it is. Like, it can be sports as well. I think this translates very well to sports because I sort of had this mentality like going into sports, and I was quite successful until I got injured. Obviously, great example to how you're not always in control of whatever happens in your life. Like you're not 100% like in control. Like no matter what happens, you still have to keep that in mind. But I think like loving like what you're doing is definitely another big factor, very very big important part of reaching whatever objective you're trying to achieve. And then afterward, I think a lot of it is problem solving, because you're going to be faced with adversity, different situations. Like how do you solve whatever problem is in front of you to then go to the next step? That honestly, I don't know like how uh, I would explain like what you need to do to get to that problem solving mindset. A lot of if you listen to like people like Elon Musk or whatever, they'll talk about how like they hire people that have this sort of mindset. But I'm gonna be honest here, I've not really stopped and think about like what does it take to have that sort of mindset. So I don't know if it's something that I've learned over time or if it's a different personality trait. I don't really know, but I know you can work on anything as soon as you're aware that you need that sort of mindset. I think it's something that you can definitely do consciously. Um, and then another one that's an important one, the mindset. What is the mindset? A lot of people get stopped by their demons. And what do I mean? What do I mean by that? People get all kinds of demons in their life, no matter what it is. No matter if it's a trauma when they were young, no matter if it's um, anything that could really stop you. Whether it's a physical inability to do something, because that's also possible. It doesn't really matter what it is. And like in life, you get all kinds of things happening to you. You can always decide to stop or take another way around and pursue whatever objective you're trying to pursue. Let me give you an example here. Um, when I said like I was really into sports, especially when I was younger, and I got stopped by an injury, it kind of goes back to what I was saying. How much do I want it? Like, I probably could have continued into sport, like focused on healing the injuries and doing like proper therapies and stuff like that. And then, taking this even like further, like if you get a disability, like there's always like other avenues that you can pursue to achieve your goals. Like, there's a lot of amazing stuff out there that you can look for, like people that lose limbs and still manage to do races and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's like how much do you want whatever you want, and then are you gonna have this mindset where no matter what happens, you're gonna persevere through it? Are you gonna make excuses, or are you gonna go forward and and go about finalizing or realizing whatever objective you're setting yourself to?
I really agree with all that. And you mentioned passion, which is funny because I don't think that's cheesy at all. And in fact, in job interviews, when I've been asked, what do you think you have that makes you successful? That's often one of the items I point to is being passionate about something. If you're doing something and you really enjoy it and you're really into it, well, then you're naturally going to want to study it. You're going to want to learn about it. You're going to want to be good at it. And all those things kind of follow naturally. So I completely agree with that list. I think that's a great list. Um, I
Absolutely. Hamish, are you gonna hire me? No, I'm just kidding. No,
uh,
but seriously, sorry to keep on going. Just a little bit about the mindset part. A lot of issues that I see, a lot of people have, like all of these that I mentioned, or almost, but especially passion. They have the desire, they have all of that, but something like I see like the most common problem, they also have that problem solving ability. Like, they have the whole package, they have everything it takes. It's really a mental block somewhere, like you don't know where it came from, you don't know why they have that, but so many people have that, this mental block where they make excuses for themselves, or they make all kinds of excuses, and it's just like you have this whole package of things that are going well for you. You have everything you would want, everything you need to achieve your objective, and then your mental barrier stops you from achieving that. It's like you're stopping yourself from achieving whatever you're trying to achieve. And so many people have that. You die, or in a, like, let's go back to Dark Souls 3. Like, you die in Dark Souls 3, and then you did not play well, or you did some mistakes, and instead of kind of accepting that and embracing that and improving upon it, you're gonna say like, ah, shit, you got lucky, or I mean, it's fine. Sometimes it happens. You have to be honest with yourself, or you'll like rage quit, or you'll uh, make excuses. All that thing, all those things, and I think ultimately that's really what you see the most that stops people from achieving or getting good at games in general. To ground back to what we were talking about initially.
Well, and along those lines, one of the things, and I've emphasized these in my videos, and it's something that I take personally to heart. And I won't go into the details here because it's kind of a long drawn out story, but these are principles I use in my personal life and in my career. And that is the kind of ability, and maybe this is part of what you're talking about with problem solving, but the ability to step back and examine your own performance in whatever context it might be. Here we're talking about video games, but to be able to look at your performance as objectively as possible and not see it filtered through the way you might want to perceive yourself, but to see your performance as it actually is, as good as it may be or as bad as it may be, and to be able to see those areas where you need improvement or those areas where you're already doing well, and therefore maybe additional effort isn't warranted, even though it might be more fun to practice the things you're good at. Do you think about those kinds of things as well?
Yeah, I think that's some. I think personally, like that's something I have, and that is, I think, strong within me. But I don't think it's a given to a lot of people, and even in a lot of professional fields. That's why we have coaches. That's why people get a good background of teachers and everyone, because you can't always see for yourself. Like uh, even if you're the best at whatever you're doing, you can't always see everything for yourself. You're gonna need a fresh pair of eyes, because no matter who you are, you do have some tainted glasses. So
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, I think it's always good to get other people's perspective on it. But I want to be careful with that, because this is very controversial. But not all opinions are equal. Uh, you know, an experienced eye will see something that the unexperienced eye will not see, and so you still have to be careful and kind of surround yourself with advices that would be relevant to whatever you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. Like you don't want to just take advice from anyone in particular, but if somebody knows their craft, then their viewpoint's going to carry more weight. That totally makes sense.
Yeah, and that goes even beyond that. It's even related. You could have someone that's really good in your field, someone that's very successful that knows their way around. They know how to achieve whatever you want to achieve, but maybe you don't necessarily want to achieve this the same way, or maybe you don't have uh, the same exact how should I put it? You're not intending to go through the same way to reach said objective. Let's bring this back to Dark Souls 3 for instance. Maybe you want to be the best at Dark Souls 3, right? You can learn from like a top player like Assassin or B-dubs, you know, someone like that, and you can be the very best player with a curve sword, right? And if you get to be the very best player or very best curve sword player, there's a very good chance you're going to reach that objective by having a mentor that's, you know, extremely good at it. But then if you still want to achieve that, maybe you have a style that's more varied. Like maybe you're trying to achieve that with various, you know, other stuff. Like maybe let's say crossbows. Like of course you're not gonna have like an assassin or B dubs teach crossbow uh, to whatever individual. Like you're gonna want to have someone like Grim to achieve that. And even though like those two kind of lead to the same spot, which is being the best at your craft or being the best Dark Souls 3 player, like it's very different play styles, and they're both right in their own regards. And so you want to kind of take into consideration that an assassin or B Dub's crossbow advice is not going to hold the same weight as a Grim advice as far as crossbow goes, because even though they're, you know, all like they all reach that objective of being the very best, uh, there's still, you know, the means at which they did it matters a lot. So just a little side note there.
Yeah, no, I for sure, I definitely agree with that. And having played against, I actually have not. I don't think I've ever played Assassin, but I've played the other two guys. They have very different styles, but also really insanely effective. So,
Yeah.
coming back to Dark Souls 3, I think I actually I was thinking about this earlier. I don't think there's anybody who I've watched play the game more than you, just by virtue of your streaming and your YouTube videos. I end up watching a lot of your gameplay, and I've definitely learned a lot from it. And
As you should. No, just kidding.
but I mean, seriously, right? Like, if you're gonna watch and learn, I watch your streams and I learn a ton. And I will actually talk some about this a little bit later. But one of the things I want to talk about here, like your style and how it differs from other people, and one of the things that I noticed about you really early on. First of all, you're one of the only top duelists that invades. In fact, I was like making a mental list the other day of like maybe roughly top 20, 30 players, at least from like a dueling perspective. And I think you're probably the only one that's invaded with any regularity. And I want to talk about that in a little bit. But your play style mixes in, for lack of a better term, like, you could think of players as either being like rustic or they're like crit fishers and swappers, and never the two shall meet. But you were one of the first top players I saw that brought in a lot of the what you might previously have considered like quote swapper behavior. Like you go crit fishing more often than a lot of duelists that I see going for backstabs, where you kind of brought that into your gameplay and brought it even into tournaments where I previously would almost never see that type of thing. What was your inspiration there? Like, where did you learn that stuff from outside of the dueling community, and what motivated you to bring that into your style?
um, I think, you know, a lot of this happens naturally. Like you play the game. At the end of the day, like the reason why I played Dark Souls 3 and I still play Dark Souls 3, I think it's a fun game. So whatever activity you enjoy in the game will kind of shape up your style. And I mean, I'm an artist myself, so when I say this, it really reminds me of a when you're drawing, your drawing style will really be influenced by what you like. And I think it's really the same thing here. If you like, you know, if you like going for that sort of stuff, you're gonna tune it. You're gonna get better at it. It goes back to what we said about the passion earlier. So if you like going for backstabs, and if you like winning, you need to, to learn the rustic play, because this is the basis. Uh, If you like, you take whatever you like, everything you like, and then you work on these and put it in the blender, see what happens.
Yeah, okay. And I know, in addition to like bringing in some of those skills into to duels and invasions, that put that specific mix that I think again started off pretty uniquely from your perspective. Coming into Dark Souls 3, like how did you first get introduced to Dark Souls 3? What made you want to play it? And did you start from like a PvE perspective first and then jump into the PvP, or was it the PvP that brought you to Dark Souls 3?
I mean, I have my little story of how I got into those games, just like about anyone. I've always been very very big on Armored Core, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's their From Software's first like really mech franchise. It's one of the oldest like video game mech franchise that's out there. Very old franchise, very very beautiful games. These Armored Core games are quite iconic. They haven't made one in a while. I'm kind of curious to know if they're working on one. Anyway, I was really into the Armored Core series, like until, like not until, but all the way back to the PlayStation One days. So, like I've got introduced to these games and From Software very very early on, without really knowing any of the Dark Souls stuff. And one day in in the one of the Armored Core games I played, this one was online. One of the buddy I had kind of suggested I tried this game, which was Dark Souls 2 at the time, and so I did. I gave it a try. Really, really liked it. It was beyond anything I had played like that. Like I was never back then. I was never into a medieval or fantasy or any sword stuff really. Like I was a shooter guy, a guy that likes sci-fi stuff, and horses and fantasy and magic and swords. This wasn't something I was really into. But Dark Souls 2 kind of changed my perspective on that. I really liked the game. I think it was very fun. And as with everything, the competitive mindset kind of takes over. And so you start with the PvE, you learn to appreciate what the game is with the artistic direction, all of that, the whole package. Learn to appreciate what this is, and then you move on to the competitive aspect of whatever there is on the table. And so in Dark Souls 2, the closest thing that there was to that was the arena and a bit of the invasions. But that's how I got introduced to the series in general.
And so then when you started playing Dark Souls 3, would you, I assume you'd have considered yourself primarily a duelist rather than an invader, or were you kind of always a mix?
Um, Going back to Dark Souls 2, I did not really have um, any exposure to any of the communities back then. Like I was just, playing just for fun on my own, and it was just, as with most people, they just play the game, when they come back from work or school or whatever, just to have fun. So to me, like that was kind of the thing with Dark Souls 2 until Dark Souls 3 came out. When Dark Souls 3 came out, like I was really excited. I really like Dark Souls 3 like a lot more than Dark Souls 2. Like to me, going into Dark Souls 2, I've always really liked it, but there was always like two huge flaws that were really bothering me when I was playing that, and it felt unfair in Dark Souls 2 when you would encounter a PvP situation, because more often than not, you would be a like very very different level to the player you'd be playing because of what we know as soul memory, right? Like which was a big big drawback for Dark Souls 2, and I think soul memory kind of uh, held me back to getting into Dark Souls 2 as much as I did with Dark Souls 3. But at the same time, it was a catalyst to, oh wow, like they actually fixed that, and now like what is the game that sort of improved on that, and that is Dark Souls 3. So getting into Dark Souls 3, I came from a background of just a guy that played to have fun, really, and Dark Souls 2 did have this competitive background though in other games, and then translating all of that, that's really how I shaped up like whatever player I am today. But sorry, to answer the original question, which was invader mindset versus dueling mindset, how I started. I would say at the beginning, I was just looking to play, so I was just touching a bit of everything, and it's funny because it's it's what ended up happening at the end of my Dark Souls 3 career. Like I'm still doing a bit of everything.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to me because there's the invader and duelist community in Dark Souls 3 is pretty split. Like there's not a ton of overlap. And I sometimes wonder why that is. like I mentioned earlier, I think if you were to probably line up the top 30 or so players, at least on like PC and PS4, because those are the communities I know, I can't think of anybody else there who invades with any on any sort of regular basis. I mean, I know some top duelists that'll do it as a lark every now and then, but very rare. And I have my own theories about why that might be, but I'm curious what you think about that. Why there would be so few duelists who choose to invade.
Yeah, yeah, I got my own answer for that. It's a different skill sets, really. So when you get good at something, you want to keep doing whatever you're good at, whatever you like. And so the invader versus duelist type of deal, like, of course, it's the same game. You're still PvPing, you're still fighting people, but there's still a very, very large difference into the skill set that's required to succeed. And I refer to that when you're dueling, it's like micromanagement of a fight. And when you're invading, it's sort of a macro management of a fight. So you have to kind of worry more about your positioning on the map, like say in an invasion, whereas in a duel, your position in relation to your opponent in a small space. So that is a literal representation of that macro versus micro relationship there. And another example of that would be how you manage your health in a duel versus an invasion. Like in a duel, you're going to be sort of like tweaking as the fight goes on, trying to squeeze in every little bit of defense, of health regeneration, of chip damage that you can get in order to achieve a successful victory. Whereas in an invasion, it's all about the big picture. Like you don't want to do chip plays if in the long term it's not going to give a good reward because people can heal almost as many times as they want. You have to mitigate risk versus reward. There's a very different dynamic there at the core that really separates the two skill set, which is dueling and invading.
I think that's very true. This and I see evidence of that kind of macro management that you're talking about when I watch you play, and I think and your risk management, and I think that that was one of the things I noticed the most. In fact, when I started watching you stream in the early days, maybe like 2 years ago, as I was watching you play, the things I noticed that jumped out at me the most that I thought were different from me, your approach to risk management. Like I take way too many chances in invasions, and I've toned that down over time, but it's still a problem. And I noticed just how kind of conservative you are when the situation calls for it, which is most of the time, right? If you're in like a 4v1 or 4v2, like you've got the blenders, everything. You've got to manage around that. And you'll take risks when appropriate. I don't mean to make you sound like a nit, but that risk management, that approach is certainly something I've seen in your gameplay. And with the, do you think you're more patient now in invasions than you were, let's say, 2 years ago, or do you think that's about the same?
I don't know. I just know that a lot of people say what you just said there, that they're not as patient, and that's why it's kind of a seed to their shortcomings. But when I watch a lot of gameplay from various people, the main issue I see is not about knowing when to hold back. It's really knowing when to push forward. I think that's the major misconception that's out there. A lot of people that I will look at play, and I don't really comment on on people's work or people's gameplay because I don't like to nitpick this stuff unless like someone specifically asks me. But more often than not, what I'll notice is that you get this window of opportunity to go for a kill, for instance, in an invasion, and you will hold back, or you will not finish your chain of roll catch, or you will not take that window of opportunity to go for a finish. This is the most common thing I see. It's like actually you mentioned something in relation to that in one of your earlier vids on your channel. It was about how you would stop attacking someone, say after a true combo. So two hits and then you would stop instead
Mm-hmm.
of going for further mix-ups. I think that's like a sort of a small sample here of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and actually, I remember that was one of like the first really big epiphanies I had when I kind of went through that transition where I realized like, oh shit, I'm nowhere near as good at this game as I actually thought I was. And then I went into like this sort of mode of like absorbing everything I could, really like reevaluating how I was playing, watching people, playing against really great players and trying to learn from them. And it was such an eye-opening experience to me, and it totally changed the way I approach the game. And for sure, that is one of the things, and that is probably one of the biggest things I noticed between my play and like maybe like an average PvPer is, you know, just the lack of pressure, the lack of pushing forward when appropriate. So I definitely agree. And it's funny because you said you know you're hesitant to nitpick at people's gameplay, and I can certainly understand and respect that. But the very next question I had for you, I'll put you on the spot to some extent, and you can feel free to shoot away with both barrels here. But I'm very curious. Like, I don't think of myself as a top player. I think of myself as a very good player, but I don't see myself, you know, anywhere near like that sort of upper echelon. And I'm curious, like, if you were to just name a couple things, and it not even necessarily about me per se, though it can be, like, what would you say are the things that separate me from one of like the top players?
Um, well, I mean, I haven't played you in like forever, so it would be hard to say. Like a lot of the things, like when you watch someone play, you get an idea of how good they are. And while I say that, I'm thinking in the back of my head, like I see so many comments in various vids where people cannot see whatsoever the difference between a good and a bad player. Like, uh, sorry about that, but common example is how like so many people really like Chase the Pro, for instance, which is understandable, very popular, and so forth. But when you look at difference in gameplay between someone like me, for instance, and someone like Chase, people will start to draw comparison between, say, the way someone uses glitches, like the way I use cancels and the way I use swaps, and they'll try to draw a conclusion based on that. Whereas the real conclusion and what you're looking for in someone's gameplay is really the fundamentals. That's what makes them successful at the end of the day, and that's what makes a good player in this game. You don't want to look at all these different things that might be very eye catching. At the end of the day, what you're looking for, and that's going back to your actual question, what I'm looking for when I'm watching someone play, no matter the skill level, is how much they manage pressure, how much like how well they can space, um, how do they time their offensive, how passive do they need to be in order to achieve the victory. Like all of these things considered, like if I had to look at someone like you, for instance, I would say, like, as in most players that are not necessarily at the top level, it really falls into a category of bad decisions when it comes to pushing forward, when to push forward, and then in the endurance game, which is I hit you, you dodge, you hit me, I dodge, that sort of thing. Like in the long run, like the reflexes over time, that's also a thing. Like that will be another like sort of common shortcoming of some of those players out there. But it varies greatly from player to player. Like everyone has their little thing that they suffer a little bit more. Like some players will panic roll more than others, while they might have better spacing, that sort of stuff. Like some players are less predictable than others, while they have other shortcomings. Like if you want me to say, like particularly for you, like you, Mish, in your case, I mean, I don't really remember like enough of your gameplay to like really pinpoint exactly like how you should be improving. But as a rule of thumb, it's getting better at spacing, getting better at no at managing and knowing, figuring out when to push forward, when to take advantage of this window of opportunity to deal some damage. Um, also, there might also be a little side note. There might also be a lot of matchup knowledge. That's another shortcoming, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, that comes with experience as well.
I actually agree about the matchup knowledge. And in fact, when I started playing the really top players, that was one thing that jumped out at me immediately. There were actually a couple things that jumped out at me. The matchup knowledge and how much matchup knowledge my opponents had, and I had very little. They knew, a lot of the specifics, like, who gets priority out of stun, after a running attack, after an R1, and all these combos and all these, intricacies of the weapons and things that I had not paid sufficient attention to. That was one thing that came up. And then the other thing that came up when I played really good players, and this actually ties back to your answer, it's really interesting. The thing that separated them that I learned right away, their ability to read and download me. And I can't tell you how many times this happened where I would fight a really good player, like, top 10, top 20 player. In the first couple of fights, I would actually do all right. In fact, I would sometimes win some of the fights in the first couple of fights. But after those first couple fights, I would just get absolutely steamrolled. And I knew enough to understand what was happening. It was because I was too predictable. They learned my play style, they knew what I was going to do, and they were able to play around it and expose my weaknesses and thrash me. And so that's certainly something that I've worked at to try to work on sort of that predictability of my behavior. But to relate this to what you said, I think people compare you to other players where the comparison maybe isn't all that warranted. And what's really interesting is the ability to assess the skill level of another player is itself a skill of being a very good player. That's something you have
Yes.
to do really
Yes.
fast and know and be able to predict their behavior and to be able to model it and to know how to react to them. And so the fact that somebody maybe compares you to somebody who isn't as good is itself evidence that the person making the statement isn't a very good player, because if they were a good player, they would spot those differences immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought you said something about what was your first point? Sorry, I wanted to say something and I just lost it.
So the second point I think was around the getting the reads, and the first point was around the matchups and like who gets
Oh yeah, the
priority.
matchups. Yeah. Okay. So, um, I want to be careful when I say that matchup knowledge is important because it is, but the matchup knowledge is a one-time deal, though. It's like once you know what you can do and what you can't do, you shouldn't really need more experience. Once you know that you have priority after a certain thing, that's good for your entire Dark Souls 3 career or whatever. So,
Right.
I see a lot of people like say that, oh, I don't have the matchup knowledge, and yeah, there's some little intricacies and like when it comes down to matchup knowledge, yes, there's priorities, but priorities once you know them, you should know them. I think the little more intricate part about when we say matchup knowledge is like what are the habits of someone with said weapon, for instance. That's more
Mm-hmm.
like the matchup knowledge
I
that
totally
matters
agree.
in a fight. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like certain idioms, like when somebody's playing with a curve sword, for example, they're more likely to attack out of stun. They're more likely to mash, and if they stop swinging, they're almost always going to go for a roll catch. And funny enough, this was another thing I learned from top players. Like invaders tend to fall into kind of one of two buckets. Like, say with like a straight sword. They're going to R1, R1, R2. And if they do that, they're going to do it consistently rather than as actually a true mix up. Or they're going to mash R1, or they're going to go for R1s and then wait for a roll catch. But of course, an experienced player knows the roll catch is coming, so they'll wait and they'll reaction roll. And I'm actually working on a video about this that'll tie this in, but they'll wait for the roll catch, and the experienced invader knows the roll catch is coming, so they wait for the roll catch. But what almost nobody does is they wait an extra beat where they wait for the player. They know they're going to try to reaction roll or maybe even prediction roll a roll catch, and so they'll roll catch the roll catch. You know what I mean? Like they'll wait for that extra beat, and that's like something I don't see very many players do. But that's another kind of thing of reading your opponent and making reads on what they're going to do. And of course, there's a risk to doing that, which is the other player might just start swinging at you instead, which is one of the reasons good players do that, to keep you from just endlessly mixing them up. And that type of making reads and adjusting, I think, definitely a huge part of what separates players.
Yeah, what you just talked about waiting for the delay to then go for a goal catch. Like the reason you don't see like that stuff often is because it's sort of like a low IV play. Like if you've played poker, like high IV stuff means that over time, statistically, this is going to be effective in more situations. And I feel like invaders in general kind of catered their game around high EV high EV situations. Whereas in duel, you really have to, like I said, micromanage each and every single situation. You can't like take the dueling skill and like apply high EV plays to every single one of your duel and expect to be a good player that way. Like in a duel, you'll want to do these low IV plays and pinpoint that yes, your opponent has recognized your pattern and you want to mix it. But in invasion, it makes more sense for invaders because they face so many players of different skill level and not really the same opponent more than once and stuff like that. And they can heal their mistake. All of that considered makes it so that for an invader, it makes more sense to go for these EV plays where parries are become a lot parries and crits and all these like high risk, high reward things become a lot more uh, prominent and you know play a big role in achieving the victory.
For sure. And along those same lines, it's not just about having high EV on a play, it's about the variance. Because to your point, in an invasion, you can go for these really high variance plays because the long run will come shorter because you can heal away your mistakes. But in a duel, it doesn't make sense necessarily to go for those plays with a high variance because they're going to cause you to take unnecessary losses. And I actually think of it, talking about poker, the difference between playing in a cash game where you're just going to want to maximize EV straight up versus maybe a tournament when what they call ICM pressure comes to play, where you have to think about chip management, which is very different than thinking about cash. And the way you can end up having to play like this really conservative game if you're playing a tournament because you're just trying not to bust out of the tournament, and getting more chips isn't necessarily as valuable, and the comparisons there are sort of interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So
So it's funny you mentioned too about like the fundamentals. And one of the so Mocha Latte actually said something to me like 2 years ago. He was trying to get me to play Street Fighter Five, and he said, Amish, you'd have an advantage coming to play Street Fighter Five because you understand the fundamentals. And too many players in Street Fighter, they get too focused on the combos and all like the kind of tech, but and they ignore the fundamentals. And I didn't really think too much about that. But as more sort of tech slash glitches have come to bear in Dark Souls 3, I see a lot more of that. Like I can't tell you how many times, like watching your stream at Pontiff, I'll see a player and they're obviously not very good. They're obviously pretty new, but they can Estus cancel, they hard swap, they're refilling their Estus, but they can't hang for even 10 seconds in a 1v1. Are you seeing more of that too?
yeah, I mean it's the sort of like the get good quick or get rich quick scheme.
Yeah.
People think there's shortcuts to it, but yeah, fundamentals take time to learn, takes experience, and that's what really makes or break the deal. That's what makes a player good or not at the end of the day. Like, of course, the shortcuts, what I call the shortcuts, are stuff that will give you a good return like right away. Like for instance, playing with PK or playing with Murky, that's a shortcut. We call this like crutches as well. But this is not gonna necessarily, make you an amazing player right away. Although in the case of shitnet, that can actually even it up quite a lot actually.
Um, on a shitty network, it truncates like 85% of the skill involved. It's
Oh
very
yeah,
frustrating.
yeah, just to drop parenthesis here, like the problem, like this game really falls apart. Like I repeat that in almost every stream. The game falls apart under high latency or lag situations. Like the skill becomes very irrelevant. A lot of the things that make or break a good player don't apply anymore, and it's almost like entirely a game of 50-50s, and so it kind of evens up the playing field quite a lot the higher the latency and the higher the lag spikes.
Exactly, and I've seen. In fact, I was watching a video today. Somebody in their video, they were playing with a very latent connection, and somebody was criticizing them or making observations about their gameplay. And the person who posted the video said, "Well, hey, the latency goes both ways, so it doesn't really matter." And I didn't comment, but I thought, no, it really doesn't. I mean, the latency might go both ways, but because it truncates so much of the skill, you've
Yes,
essentially robbed the other person of the ability to beat you from skill by having this bad network connection. It's awful.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, talking more about skill and thinking about these sorts of things, one of the big evolutions in your gameplay is clearly around hard swapping. And I think you really first started doing that maybe like a year and a half ago, maybe even 2 years ago. And it obviously not only changed the way you play the game, I mean, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say it has completely changed the meta. Everybody does it now, or if they don't, they realize it's a shortcoming in their game. And I was thinking about this, and I think a lot of players react very negatively to hard swapping. In fact, some players call it a glitch. I can't tell you how many Reddit discussions I've gotten dragged into around this. But here's the weird thing I was thinking about, and I'm curious what you think. So hard swapping to me raises the skill gap, right? It enables you to
Yes.
differentiate your gameplay from another player. There's counterplay that the other person has to engage in to manage the fact that you can hard swap on them. There's certain things you have to think about and do. And while I generally think anything that raises the skill gap is good, I do wonder if in a game like Dark Souls 3, and take away like Pontiff and Ring City for a moment in meta, and let's think about the game more broadly. Part of the reason I think Dark Souls 3 works is because most players, they may be PvE focused, but when they're thrust into a PvP fight, it basically works the way that they expect. It's intuitive. And even if they lose, they can still kind of understand why they lost and maybe what they did wrong. But when you bring in tech like hard swapping, it while it raises the skill gap, in some sense makes the game less intuitive, maybe like Dark Souls 1 backstabs. And for invasions where you're mixing like PvE and PvP, and you have to expect that a lot of the players won't necessarily be steeped in the ways of PvP. Like, do you think that's in any way bad for the game?
I think, I mean, that's a fair point. Like, to say that it's not as intuitive. I mean, I can't really argue with that. It's definitely not intuitive. Otherwise, other people would have figured that out way before me, because I've got introduced to the series fairly late. If you consider that this swapping stuff has been around, and when I say it's been around, it's been possible to do in all previous Souls games, and no one really implemented that, at least not on a consistent or a good level of play. And so when I look at all of this, like, yeah, of course it's not intuitive. The proof is in the pudding. Like, no one ever really did that before I came around. So, yeah, of course. But do I think it's a good or a bad thing? I mean, obviously, I think it's a good thing. I use it. I mean, I don't really have anything else to like kind of say about that. I mean, at the end of the day, it becomes sort of like a question of how you would want your game. Like that, it comes down to that. Like at the end of the day, like it's more a question of personal preference than anything else. I think because as far as balance goes, like you said, it does raise the skill level. So you should reward the player that spends more time and get more skilled. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, and I agree with that in general. And I think there's kind of two questions here, right? One is, do I use it or should I use it? And then separate from that is it good to be in the game overall, right? Like, and I can definitely, and I don't necessarily think this about hard swapping, but I think it would be perfectly consistent to say, yes, I use it. Yes, I recommend it. Yes, I think it's a great strategy, but maybe the game would be better if it wasn't in there at all. Now, I'm not saying that I actually think that.
Let
And
me
I,
offer you something here. Let me cut you off real quick. Um, a lot of this side of the story that I hear, people that don't necessarily want to get into hard swapping, they're like it's repulsive for them for whatever reason because it's not intuitive and whatever. But at the end of the day, once you start really getting into that stuff, what's really appealing here, and I'm talking to you directly, like really the appeal in swapping in general is that it opens up so many possibilities. It opens up so much.
mm-hmm.
It really kind of opens the balance up to using weapons, like giving a purpose to weapons that would otherwise, in the very base game, to the bare bone, would have no purpose. Like stuff like if you're trying to achieve victory, you now have a purpose of using a whip, whereas if you're trying to win, like a duel against someone, like duel with Murky and PK and stuff like that, there's no purpose here to bring a whip to the table. Whereas when you start to integrate swapping, you can give this window opportunity for this particular weapon to shine in that particular moment. You bring in more of the stuff that's in the game and put it in action on the table and make it effective and useful. You're able to now take bits and pieces that were otherwise useless and bring it on the table and make it useful and bring more to the game that was previously there.
I agree with that actually. I think you know one again, separating the good players from the bad ones. I see bad players that just kind of like mindlessly swap to maybe Gundyr or something else, and they seem to not appreciate the real value of swaps and in which context. And I'll see if I can find a link and try to leave a link to it in this video, but Book of Matches had a really great video where he talks specifically about the virtues of certain types of swaps, like the Lido swap, right? It's like a poise bait where the other player is gonna outpoise you, and so they're gonna happily come in and look to trade with you. So if you approach them, maybe they've got like a great sword and you've got a straight sword, they're looking for a trade, which makes it much easier to bait them into that Lido swap and then trade with the weapon art. And so I totally agree with you. A lot of the swaps have a lot of interesting value in different contexts, and they are definitely enrich the game. At least for me, I think it's really cool.
Yeah, but like another, like I'm listening to you right now, and I always hear about the Gundyr and the Lidos of this world, and that's what I use. That's what I sort of like. That's what I like to use, and that's what I sort of integrated into my gameplay. But I did like other streams where I would try other swaps, and I didn't really get into it, not because it's not effective, but because I like the other stuff that so I sort of like came up with. I like using the Lido and the Gundyr, but the problem is when people watch me, they don't really try to be creative for themselves and try to push the boundaries further, because there is still room to push this a little bit further. When I did a stream with some of the worst weapons in the game, I ended up being forced to use stuff like the wooden hammer with Drang hammer, and then the whip and all of that. And I realized that there is so much untapped potential for like these horrible weapons, that if someone just takes the time to take whatever usefulness there is out of, say, like the whip weapon art, because I've been bringing that example a lot. Like, if someone in the community actually sets up an inventory with a bunch of whips, where the whips becomes an integral part of their gameplay, it could be like so useful. But no one, like, really, I would need to be the one to do it. I don't have the motivation necessarily or the desire to go there, but it's out there. Like, people try to go for the Gundyr and the Lidos because they know it's effective and they've seen it and it's battle proven. But there is other possibilities out there. That's what's great about swapping. Not necessarily, like, people don't necessarily realize that, but there are so many other possibilities, other different situations where different combination of weapons could be used well. And you know what's funny about all of this? This sort of aspect, mentality, kind of direction translates over to Elden Ring. They really integrated that with the sort of assign a weapon art to a weapon thing. It's sort of like the same deal where you take a little bit of something and then you apply it to another weapon to make it better, to give it a purpose. So I think even From Software, I don't know if they did that purposefully or not. I think some of that sort of mentality and mindset and usefulness for everything kind of comes back into play in Elden Ring one way or another, integrated into the assign a weapon art to a weapon thing.
Yeah, and it's funny, like your point about people not being very innovative with respect to swapping. Obviously, I completely agree with that, but it's really not even about that. It's just most players, and frankly, I probably count myself in this group. We're just not very innovative, right? There's a core of people that are out there trying to push the boundaries and try to figure out new stuff, new tech, new combos, different setups. And just there's not a lot of people pushing those boundaries. And I know, like before you, Mocha Latte came along, and that offhand hand axe, that changed the meta for a while as people started to see the value of having something that was offhand and very fast and difficult to reaction roll and good at roll catching. But most people aren't out there trying to figure those things out. You're like, what's the next hand axe, for example, or what other combo should I be using? People are just going to look and see what other people have done and what works well. Like it goes well beyond just the hard swaps.
Yeah, and to bring in a little some of my friends in there. Like, I'm thinking, like, when you say all of these things, I'm thinking, I say like being innovative. Like, there's a lot of really good players that have innovated in the game. Like, I'm thinking of someone like Painted Phantom. Painted Phantom, for those of you who don't know him, probably the guy who won the highest number of tournaments in this game, 1v1 tournaments. And there's a reason for it. Painted always looked for that next combo, the next type of setup where it could really time it and roll catch someone. And Painted really innovated in his own regard into all his setups. He brought something like way back when, Curve Sword was so dominant. He came out of nowhere with something like Perseverance and Mailbreaker. No one even knew Perseverance was good like back then. Like no one really realized the value of all these things until someone like him brought him to the table, like by trying stuff out, by looking at what could be different. Like all of these things, like there's a lot to be found out there. Like right now, obviously we're late into the game, so that a lot of this stuff is a lot less obvious. I think it's a bit more difficult to like innovate with swap because the barrier of entry is might be a bit higher because you need to be extremely efficient with fast button sequences, whereas when you try to learn stuff like or figure out stuff with different weapon combinations or combos or timings and stuff like that, like you said, it's more intuitive. But at the end of the day, this sort of innovative mindset, as I've always been around from one player to the next, one really good player to the next, I should say. And yeah, I'm not the only one out there that that has been like pushing the boundaries of meta. Like good players have been doing that for since the game came out.
Mm-hmm. Yep, agreed. And Painted Phantoms in particular, like has so many different crazy setups that he's come up with. They're all really effective, and I'll leave a link to the video where I had some fights with him, and he showed me a bunch of those builds, including I think the Perseverance and Mailbreaker build, and he just absolutely destroyed me with that setup because I'd never seen anything like it before, and I didn't even really know how to respond to it. And
Yeah,
thinking,
that's matchup knowledge. Yeah, sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
and knowing what I know now, it's really interesting and talking about innovating in this game because there's a guy who some current players may not know. Scott Yund is his name. He goes as
Yeah,
Damn No HTML. He was a big player in the early Dark Souls scenes and early in Dark Souls 3. And he had like a weapon tier list that had come out probably like, I don't know, 3, 4 months after the game released. And there were things like Cestus and the reinforced club that were like at the rock bottom just because nobody had
yeah,
figured out how to make those things useful yet. And
yeah.
it's just interesting to see how that's kind of gotten turned around over time.
Yeah, that's so true, and brings back yeah fun memories. But yeah, absolutely. When you get someone that comes along and categorize stuff, I love Scott John. Like I wish he would come back for Elden Ring, but I mean he's doing his own thing. Definitely, like I started getting into the competitive scene by watching Scott John like on this game. Did not even know there was like tournaments on this game before I saw Scott John host the tournament for Dark Souls 3 when not so long after it came out. But yeah, to your point, absolutely. People kind of categorize stuff like when the game releases and kind of very very easily brush aside where they should be focusing their attention to without necessarily touching everything.
Yep, and I also started learning from his videos too. Like I remember when I first started dueling, I had no idea what I was doing. And I remember thinking to myself like, how do I know when to swing and how and when I shouldn't? Like I was starting to generate some intuitions about it, but I knew they weren't very good. And I started watching his videos, and he was talking about things where if you've played fighting games before, you would have already known like whiff punishing and spacing and those sorts of things, but I had never done that, so I didn't know any of those things. And so his videos were such a revelation to me, and I'm sure they stand up pretty well today. I mean, I'm sure some of the weapon information is a little outdated from number of patches, but the basics of what he was teaching, like it's still relevant today, and I thought he made some of the best videos around.
Oh yeah, definitely agree there. Like I mean, you can't like early on like that. There is no way you can be right and like predict absolutely how the game is going to be shaping up and what's everything that's good and everything that's bad. There's just no way you can do that. No, I think you really laid out like some solid foundations to the next wave of players.
Yeah, yeah, big fan of his. In fact, I've actually, I'll tell you, I've tried reaching out to him on a couple of occasions to try to talk to him and in fact talk about how the meta's changed since he's left. And I haven't really been able to get a good response. And I'm sure he's obviously moved on to other things, so he's probably not interested. totally understand that, but I share your hope that maybe he'll come back for Elden Ring. So we'll have to see.
Yeah.
So we've talked about weapons, we've talked about matchups, and I would say you're known primarily for your greatsword, and I'm sure a lot of people know this already. Greatsword is not an easy weapon to use in duels. Against players that are above average, I find there a tremendous amount of difficulty using that, especially against like maybe sword and board. If you're using just a physical greatsword build, you're not using like a dark infusion or something like that. It's a very challenging weapon to use effectively. That's really great in invasions for a number of reasons, but for duels, it's really tough. How did you get started using greatsword, and kind of what motivated you to main that weapon so often?
It's funny that you say people know me for Greatsword. If you've been if you've been around for a long time, you know that has always been my trademark, and like what I would have separated myself with. But nowadays, like people that just discover me, they think it's the daggers and the murky. It's actually funny. But yeah, uh, the thing is, it goes back again to what we've talked about earlier. What you like if you have a passion for something. I just thought that the claymore was the best looking weapon in the game, so I really wanted to stick with it just because of that. And I learned it upside down. And once you like something, you just push it as far as you can push it, even if the weapon has limitation. So again, it goes back to um, how, like, what do you want to improve on? Like, Painted, brought the mail breaker, brought all of that. Like, I decided to pick decided to swap the Gundyrs of this world, the Lidos of this world. Before that, I was focusing on the Claymore of this world, on like other things. Other people have focused on different things. This is just the stuff I liked and I focused on.
Well, it's funny because like that's definitely true, and people have their own preferences. I too actually really like the way that the claymore looks. I think it's a cool weapon. It's fun to use. But even though like I may like that weapon, if I'm going to do duels, I'll typically like unless I'm really trying to push myself and I'm like approaching a bunch of duels with the mindset of okay, I'm probably gonna lose more, but it's worth it because I'm gonna learn how to use this weapon better. If I'm just coming in and I'm trying to win duels, I'll abandon the greatsword just because me personally, I find it too difficult to play against other players. I mean, did you encounter any of that at all?
Uh, Actually, it's funny that you say that because a lot of people will see me nowadays not engage with the claymore as much in try hard fights, and it is true that the your win rate or the challenge is much higher because the weapon is not as effective as some of the other like meta weapons. But with all that being said, for those who've been following the channel and following me for a long time, you know that I've played at all levels, just sticking with the greatsword, especially back then. And I've played like back then when the best players were using PK and all of that. I've stuck with claymores like in tournaments and fights and all of that, and actually won tournaments just by playing with greatsword. So it is possible, but it like over time, like when you start playing with something like the greatsword against meta stuff, it kind of boils down, if you want to win, to being extremely conservative, passive, and I say passive. It's not necessarily passive, but it it becomes an endurance fight. Like you always want to stay on your toe, and you have this sort of layout of a game where you have this particular spacing that you always want to keep. You cannot miss a roll. You always have to like do these things to keep you safe and always stay involved in the fight, not being passive. But like with all these considered, you have to do this for a very long period of time because you're not going to catch your opponent very often with the great sword. So when you're fighting these really good players, yes, it is possible to beat them with an inferior weapon like a great sword, but it takes some like real mental like fortitude to just stay in that fight for so long, trying to keep your game as tight as possible for a long period of time until the opponent makes a mistake, because at the end of the day it becomes a game of mistake. It's just much easier to force someone to make a mistake with a murky or a PK and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's true. And one of the things that I've noticed about watching you play, when you play Greatsword, your approach generally seems to be, and you feel free to correct any of this if I get it wrong, but your general approach seems to be, use the threat of your hyper armor to kind of push in against people and make them uncomfortable, force them into some sort of mistake, either like a rolling mistake, or that you can roll catch or maybe backstab, or a trading mistake where you seem to do a good job of anticipating when people are going to try to stop you from pushing them around and maybe a turn and burn, and then force a trade instead, which obviously will trade very much in your favor. But
I would say that's a bit of the that's like the approach I kind of adopted more nowadays because of swapping. Like swapping allows you, when you force a pace like that, you force people into situations where they cannot attack you back. Otherwise, they might trade with the great sword, but they are faced with the threat of the next swap that's coming. So that's something I added new to the game, but that's not necessarily something that's uh, uh, necessarily specific to the claymore. Like if you were to play pure claymore, pure greatsword, it is not the approach I would take. Like if you rewind back a few years ago and watch some of the vids there, I do a lot of R2's turnaround, and that is more of the conservative approach you have to take to be successful in pure greatsword fights. So little bit of a difference here between the playstyle, kind of adapted to the swap game a little, but ultimately it plays a bit different when you're sticking just for the greatsword.
That's a good point, and actually, that's something I've seen from you. Especially, some players will get really passive versus a greatsword, and I understand that to some extent because most people when they play against greatsword, they want to just outspace and whiff punish, but that, so you're not going to just recklessly throw R1s out that are going to lead you easily being outspaced, and so you're going to kind of push in, and then players will sometimes get very passive, and I've noticed that you'll often use that opportunity to hard swap to something like Corvian, and then you've essentially used the claymore to get up close, and then now you're in their face with Corvian, and you're able to mix them up a bit, do some damage, and then it kind of resets to neutral, and then you go back to the greatsword, and that seems to be like a really effective approach.
Yeah, that's the sort of like the evolution of the playstyle, and that's why I sort of came along uh like that's why I went that way, because what's cool about this sort of playstyle is that you're imposing your pace, whereas if you're playing pure greatsword, you're really dependent on your opponent's mistakes. Whereas what I like to play and how I like to play, I like to force the other guy to get caught in like roll catches. Like you have to force the pace on your opponent, and that's really why like the swapping came like mixed into play with the greatsword. And even like years ago, I started integrating that through soft swapping. I would soft swap to Corvian in specific situations in order to take advantage of getting close to the opponent to sort of mix up the game a lot more. And obviously, over time, it developed into the hard swapping part, and how it's much more difficult to pull off, but the reward is much higher as well. But ultimately, those are sort of like an evolution to push the pace of the game, because if you were to play just pure greatsword, it would be played a lot more conservatively, and it would be a lot more boring to watch. It becomes a game of like you have this specific way you're playing until the other guy makes a mistake. It's like you're doing a lot of R2s, but you're turning all of them around just to make sure you don't get whiff punish. You get these opportunities to get close, but you don't overextend. There's like all these different variations here that sort of change depending on what you're going for and what your end goal is.
That's interesting. And I guess I didn't probably sufficiently appreciate the difference that hard swapping has made even to what I would think of as like your core claymore play. But that totally makes sense. And now thinking about it, I agree. Like the unlocked R2 turnaround to avoid getting whiff punished. Like that's such a critical component. Like great swords that don't have the poke almost become unplayable unless you're playing against total noobs, just for that very reason. Like you've got to mix up that spacing game. Otherwise, people can stand like just at the outside of your R1 range, and that R2 is like the only thing to take them off of it.
Yeah, and if you start to integrate swapping into your game, this R2 sort of becomes like a side thing, whereas it's a absolute centerpiece for like a pure claymore or pure greatsword play. But if you take that away, you can have a very similar game to what like I have now, with other greatswords, even without the poke. If you integrate swaps into it, but if you remove swaps and you get the weapon as a standalone, the R2 is an absolute necessity. But I mean, either way, like it's still better to have the option for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one thing that came up, and this is a question I've actually wondered about for a while. And in fact, I asked you about this on stream the other day, and I think I got part of an answer, but I'd like to press in on this a little bit. So one thing that I've seen that you're very good at, and maybe better, this in fact maybe the skill you have that jumps out at me the most in the sense that it differentiates you the most from other players that I watch on stream, and definitely separates you from me, and that's your ability to pressure somebody and yet still fairly reliably reaction roll their attacks. Like you avoid turn and burns so much better than almost anybody else I know. And you can anyone can avoid turn and burns if that's all you're looking for, but it's that ability to maintain the aggression and to keep swinging and to still be able to manage those reaction rolls. And I know you talked about using quick step, and that definitely helps, but even just rolling, I see that you're so much better at that. Do you have any sort of like mindset that you employ to do that, or like what's your thought process that enables you to pursue both kind of that aggressive style and still avoid counterattacks from your opponents?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you'll be satisfied with the answer because, yes, there is an absolute strategy there that's not just reaction. So, when you're following someone that's turn and burning, there's this important factor that comes into play. It's the distance you keep between your opponent. You get this sort of like safe space when you're chasing someone. You're still spacing them as you're chasing them, and that's very important. As soon as you get into that danger zone when you're chasing someone, as soon as you get in range, if they were to turn around and attack, is when you enter that mindset as where, okay, I have to roll now. Like, I have to be ready to roll. And it's most likely when the attack is going to come. So you know when the attack is going to come depending on range. And that applies to various situations in game, but that's also uh, very common in a situation of turn and burn. Like, keeping the proper distance is half the work, and then recognizing when the proper distance is not met, you get into that state of like, I have to roll. So getting ready for it is a huge part of being able to pull it off.
That's a really interesting answer. And it's funny, like that sort of pre-spacing of turn and burns is something that I learned when I was doing spear fights. Like a couple of years ago, as I was improving, I was still doing spear fights. And, very often I would spend big part of the fights was chasing people around. And that was something I learned. Like I'd get hit by turn and burns, and then I realized, oh, well, I can just space those out like anything else and anticipate it. And you could immediately see that once you start doing that, it makes your opponent very uncomfortable because they're being pursued, but they can't just turn around and attack you and force you to break pressure. And then that puts them in a position where they're much more likely to either be aggressive and you can start punishing them, or to be even more defensive and you can take advantage of that too.
Yeah, if you want to get into the specific, even like the way you do that is like when you're chasing someone, like normally spacing is like you create distance forward and backward, right?
Hmm.
Like you're chasing someone, but when you space when chasing someone down, your spacing becomes like sideways as you're going forward. So in order to keep the chase going, what you're doing is you're basically creating some distance by sort of separating yourself to the side while always going forward. And I think that's where people kind of miss that spacing part. They think there's no spacing, but the spacing happens when you're chasing someone sideways. That's really where it comes to.
That's interesting. And I do incorporate that as well. I don't think as much as you, and I have noticed you doing that. So that's probably an area of opportunity for me. Um, and related to like spacing of turn and burns and being able to avoid those, you roll curved swords really, really well. And you seem very comfortable fighting people that have curved swords, both like in duels and invasions. And this is a question I've asked a bunch of different people. I've gotten a bunch of different answers. I keep thinking one of these days I actually want to test it in a video. But do you think that the majority, well, speak for yourself maybe personally, and then we can talk about other players, but there's always a debate with Curve Sword is whether people are reaction rolling it or they're rolling it based on reads. And I think like Gabri once said to me, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but this is my recollection. Gabri said he doesn't think many people reaction roll Curve Sword at all. He said it's almost all based on reads because it's just too hard to roll on pure reaction. I mean, you have a lot of success rolling Curve Swords. Like, what's your position on that?
Okay, so I'm a bit biased to what Gabri said. I'm gonna be honest, and I'm gonna explain it. It's not as simple as that though. Like, okay, so to sort of like discuss this, I think we have to break this down like to the core. Like, what does it come down to? We're talking reaction time here, right? Reaction time will vary from person to person. That is, like we, it's not very hard to understand. Like we have different reaction time from person to person. Then what comes after this is what's most important. The gear you're using. So are you playing at the same frame rate as your opponent? That's a big factor. Are you using the same monitor refresh rate as your opponent? Like you get these little frames here that you're winning or losing in relation to your opponent when it comes to reaction time. So the moment you have lag in your controller, your inputs, your computer, your monitor, like all these things add up. And so when you mitigate that, and first, that's going to vary from player to player because we're not all playing on the same gear. So that's going to play a huge part of it. Then on top of that, you have the variation that is the reaction of said players. You can actually go to uh, just Google human benchmark and you get these Twitch reaction tests where the screen like turns green and you have to click with your mouse when the screen turns green and it gives you the amount of millisecond that it took for you to click the screen. And something I've noticed because I've done a lot of these is that it's so intricate. Like there's so much that comes into play here. My hand position will play a major role into the outcome in millisecond that like this test will give me, for instance. Whether I use this test with a controller or a mouse, that will play a major role too. The way I position my fingers, the way if I do tension before the click or no, all of these things will like impact the amount of time it takes for a response, like in huge ways. Like you can go from a 160 millisecond to like a 220 millisecond just in different positions. And so I think a lot of it is a lot more science based than people might think. And then after all of this is considered, this is what Gabri said really comes into play, and not like people don't realize it. When you have so much experience with the game, like you might be at a disadvantage or an advantage in regards to all the what we just mentioned, but because you have so much experience, you know when the hit is coming, you know when to anticipate those things. And I know for a fact, having played a lot on 24, 20, 30 fps, I've not always played this game at 60 fps on PS5 and PC. Like I came from Xbox where the FPS was kind of shit. Like you play 4 FPS in the archive sometimes, like literally, like it can drop as low as that. The game like can play in some areas at a steady 20. Like I've played all of these situations, and when the FPS is that low, um, hey, you cannot reaction roll or you cannot react to like everything that your opponent is doing. So a lot of this, like the groundwork, is all prediction and reads. And when like you've been in those situations so many times, like with your experience, you can tell when the swing is coming, and therefore you can sort of like manage the risk and the rolls a lot better. But having like being there myself, being on both sides of the spectrum, where I've had bad gear and have had like really poor reaction time due to the game being extremely slow. And like now where I have a PlayStation 5, 60 FPS, a really good monitor and everything, and the reaction is very fast. My success in relation to the platform I was in has always been the same, like regardless of those things. So at the end of the day, I think that what's most important is what Gabri said about the experience and rolling and dodging in relation to your experience and knowing when the hit is likely to come. I think that's the major part that plays a role into that. But afterward, when you start to put two players that are equally skilled together, now that's really when they get separated by, you know, these other factors that we've talked about, the like the monitor, the you know, the hand position, like all of these little minute details. That's what separate the players on equal playing field afterward. So this is how I see it.
You know, that's interesting, and that accords with kind of how I've looked at it, where if like let's say you and I were, our characters were just standing next to each other, and I had a PK, and then maybe once every 10 seconds or so I would just kind of randomly swing it. My guess is you would probably reaction roll, a healthy percentage of them, but I'm guessing I would also hit you with a healthy percentage. But when I come up to you, and or maybe I've hit you once with the PK already, there's like a handful of timings that I can use. And
Yes.
so you're going to be especially attuned to those and ready to roll at any one of those. And maybe I think maybe you're kind of saying the same thing, and it's that combination of reads and being primed to do something that makes it that much easier to do it when you need to do it on reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think though at the end of the day, it's a mix of all of those. I think it would be disingenuous to give a straight answer and say, yeah, this is exactly what's happening. I think it's really a mix of all of those put together. But it would be interesting to, maybe in Elden Ring, who knows, to get a test together, like a bunch of test subjects, and you get people to randomly get hit at absolute random intervals in non-fighting situations, see how everyone reacts to things, like noting their monitor and everything like that, just to see the difference between player reaction time, if it's really the same across the board, no matter if you're a casual or not, or if it's really like there's like other factors that are a major influence to that.
Yeah, and like I said, I've kicked around the idea of making a video like that, and I have experimented with that reaction time. In fact, I think somebody posted it in a Discord that you and I were part of at one point, and everybody in there was testing it out. And I actually did okay on that. I remember having pretty good reaction times, but I didn't really play around with like different hand positions or anything like that, which is sort of interesting, and maybe that's something I'll have to try out. So,
Yeah, yeah, the end positions plays a big factor, a lot more than people might think. The even like the you know how like you can flicker your finger, like if you do a fist, right? You can have like your thumb knuckle kind of up or down, right?
mm-hmm.
These two different positions will affect massively how the reaction time is translated into the game. Stuff, very minute details like that. And I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than others. It's probably different from one individual to the next, but you have to figure these things out on your own.
Yep, yeah, that's a good feedback. I'm gonna have to go back and give that a shot. So we've talked about like getting better at the game or getting better at any sort of life endeavor, and I think for me anyway, one of the big motivators of improvement is the fact that I hate losing. Like I hate losing so much, and I play it down sometimes. But like I've had times where I hate losing so much that I would actually like I would obsess about a loss for like days on end because it would bug me that
Yeah,
much. And
and
I've
DC and send hate mail. Yeah. Oh no, I think I'm thinking of other people. Never mind. Sorry.
Well, you're actually anticipating part of the question that's coming, but I mean, I'm assuming you probably really hate losing. And do you consider that an important motivation in your journey to improve as a player?
Yeah, actually, and I think there might be something to say here. Like I mention a lot, like I back in my Rainbow Six days, one of the player that was much older than me, that kind of I took him as a mentor, and it's something that he would say very often is like, um, loser for life, kid. Like when he would kill someone and the guy would rage quit, he would always say the same lines like, loser for life, kid, loser for life. And he would fucking say the exact same. The guy was like, like this guy was an older dude, like a dad that already have had a life and everything behind him, married with kids and all of that. And I always found the trash talk funny because it was not his type. Like, he was not a mean person or anything like that. But these words resonated so much with me. And there's a like I have to touch on this a little bit because there's such a strong hidden meaning here. Like this loser for life kid, it really comes down to like, are you gonna give up like when the
Right.
adversity comes? That's really what it comes down to. Like, what are you gonna do now? What are you gonna do now? Like, you're faced with adversity. What are you gonna do now? It translates into every part of your life. It's not just gaming. Like, yes, you can see it in the game. Like the guy rage quit in games. There's a good chance like this guy is a quitter as well. In other areas. Not saying that your skill at game translates into your success in life, but this trait of personality, it just does not lie elsewhere in your life. Like it's beautiful. What can I say?
I completely agree. And when I see people disconnect, to me, I think you just lost twice. Like I beat you once and then you beat yourself.
Yeah, definitely beating yourself is yeah, a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to that improvement mentality, right? Like it's okay to lose. You take something away from it, learn what you did wrong, and you can come back stronger the next time. And that's the way to approach it. But if you just are gonna disconnect and try to pretend like it never happened, well then you're never gonna learn anything from it, and you're just gonna kind of stagnate. And this brings me to kind of one of the last questions I want to ask you. One of the things I find myself thinking about a lot, people that gank, and I want to emphasize here, I'm talking about the shitters, not just people that run ganks occasionally, or they're playing co-op with their friend. I'm talking about like the real committed shitters. And
That's my favorite subject, by the way. Keep going. Sorry.
well, they're somewhat mysterious to me, and I find myself thinking about them and asking like, what is it that makes these guys really tick? Because I mean, I'm sure we all know ganking is the game on easy mode. Running an invader down
Do
with a
we though? Do we know if it's ganking on easy mode? Do we know it's that?
you're not questioning whether it is easy, right? You're questioning whether they know it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that would
Yeah.
imply. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly where I'm headed with this. So just give me a bit of space here, and I'll put the question to you. So yes, it's the game on easy mode. You're running a red down when in a 3v1, a 4v1 with no friendly fire. I mean, it's beyond trivial. It's super easy to do. And those of us who invade, and I count myself among this group, I sometimes run ganks for various reasons, for streams, whatever. But I never draw any conclusions about it. Like if I win, I don't think, oh, we bested him. I just think, well, we've got the gank, so we get to win more often. That's just kind of how it is. And when I kind of ask people, like, what makes these guys, these shitters that want to come to Pontiff night after night after night and ply their trade, not somebody that comes out there once a month, has some drinks with his friends. I'm talking about the guys that are out there night after night. Like, what makes them tick? And some people have tried to suggest that it's about salt generation. They want to create drama or create salt. But I'm not sure I actually believe that. I do kind of think it really comes down to the fact that they get to quote win, and it makes them feel like they're good at doing something. Do you disagree with that?
I think both points are true. I think there's a bit of both. I think if you've been around all kinds of people in your life, you'll know that not everyone's nice. There's some people that really you just want to see the world burn, as the Joker would say. There's some people like that, and I think proportionally speaking, that would fit to like how many shitters there are in comparison with how many normal players there are in that sense. But yeah, absolutely. Like I think a very large majority of those people fit the bill of what you just mentioned, of just someone that does not necessarily have someone to make something to make them feel good about themselves, like in life in general, which is very sad. It's very sad to say, and it's very judgmental, and it's it kind of is. It's not baseless, but it almost is because you don't really know these people. I don't really know these people. As far as I can tell, they could be really nice outside of the game, which I doubt they are. I really doubt they are, but it's still a possibility. Like some people have get into these sort of different mindsets when they get in and outside of games. Like I have a little story to share here. I've had this friend, which I've won 400 tournaments with, by the way. I've been playing with this guy since the Rainbow Six days. He's the type of guy that's like, a good dude, very generous dude, but he has these um, raging moments. These raging moments where it just does not give a single fuck about your feelings for a set period of time. And I've played with him, and he has said some of the meanest things I've ever heard to like some random, absolute random people when we were playing games. And a good example of that is when I was playing the Division. There was a beta at some point when the Division first came out, which is an older Ubisoft game. It's not that old actually, but they had a beta, and one key feature in that beta was proximity voice chat. And for those of you who don't know, proximity voice chat is you can hear and say whatever you want to any other enemy player when you get close to them, whether they're enemy or not. And so it creates these situations where you're meeting a stranger that you're never ever gonna meet ever again, and maybe you will in the same world, the same day. You don't know, but for whatever reason, you have this whiteboard where you can say whatever the fuck you want to this person, and if you're just let loose, you can go ham and start. This guy was insulting people so badly left and right just because he thought it was funny, and while I don't agree with that, it was absolutely hilarious. There's no denying that. Like some of the things he said, like I would never say or even repeat. It's so stupid and hurtful. But the fact that he did those things so freely and like in a freedom of mind state, like no remorse, nothing. Yet it was this really cool dude, very like loving dude, and had friends and family outside of that. It You feel like it doesn't fit the personality, but a lot of people have this sort of like dark side as well. So, I mean, to me, like, I don't necessarily want to say that these gankers are all like that, because I had a friend who was actually like that, and he's not a bad person per se, but he does like it could be a shitter in Dark Souls 3. Well, just outside of that, he's just another normal working citizen.
It's and that's a good point that you bring up, how somebody's behavior in game isn't necessarily reflective of who they are as a person, but at the same time, on the flip side, the shield, it's anonymity is a sort of shield in people when they feel like they're
Yes.
not being identified. Like somebody will drive in a certain way, like maybe cut people off, but they wouldn't
Yeah.
in the grocery store. They would never like just cut in line in front of you face to face, and that social separation enables behaviors that you wouldn't see otherwise, and that certainly applies to online games. But I do think even when people act like that, I think you hit on this. I think that is a part of them, and kind of their shadow, and maybe a part of them that they don't express very often, but occasionally they
Yeah.
let the beast out.
I think you really explained this pretty well. I think, like you said, I think it's part of the person. It's just that I would not like define this entire person or my friend here in this instance as, someone who does that. But I think there is no denying that this very behavior is an integral part of him. Like you said, like they wouldn't necessarily do that in like a grocery store, but as soon as you start to take some separation between the direct interaction, it becomes kind of like this desensitizer, something like that.
Yeah. Well, dude, I think we've been talking for quite a while, and certainly longer than I had originally planned for. But as expected, this has been a really fun conversation. And I know before the actual discussion started, you and I talked a little bit about how long it had been since we'd actually talked to each other like this, and it's been a long time. So, man, I'm really glad that you were able to come on here and we were able to do this. I know we've talked about potentially doing this for a while. I'm glad we were able to make it happen. Anything you want to share? Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, Amish, thank you so much for doing this. We should do this more often, not necessarily, spending hours on end, but I really appreciate talking to you. You've always have this very interesting, very civil perspective. You really do have your ways around individuals in general. You know how to interact properly with others, and it's quite enjoyable to be around you, Amish. And I think I'm not the only one who thinks that. It's quite a blast to interact with you in general. Really appreciate all of that.